Today's conversation is brought to you by J29 Coalition. Pastor, we know the challenges you face in today's polarized world. Guiding your congregation through the complexities of politics while keeping Jesus at the center feels like an uphill battle. That's why the J29 Coalition exists. We're a network of pastors committed to recapturing the evangelical political imagination, anchoring it in the teachings of Jesus and his kingdom. We've designed a 3-month program specifically for working pastors like you. Visit j29coalition.com today to learn more.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. Today, we are bringing back John Inazu, a constitutional lawyer and professor of law and religion at Washington University, who joined the podcast in 2020. He is also the author of several books, including his latest, Learning to Disagree. Today, we talk about building bridges in a democracy, the role of the people of God in a pluralistic society, empathy, forgiveness, and a lot more. John, thanks so much for joining our podcast. We're grateful to have you on today's conversation.
Walter, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So that's an interesting background that you have. Constitutional scholar, litigator, which I typically don't think in terms of bridge building. How did you move from this kind of world in which you occupy litigation, scholarship, to entering into this building bridges type of work?
So it's a great question as to the self-interested nature of some lawyering. And it's certainly true that you can get into law just to maximize your own self-interest or your money. But there's an important part of law, I think, that is for the strengthening of democracy as well, that we're training not just lawyers, but also citizens. And we recognize as lawyers and citizens that democracy, politics, and law itself is what we have in place as an alternative to resolving our disputes through violence. And there's a really important element that is not just self-interested, but is other-interested in learning arguments, learning disagreement in order to resolve them more peacefully than not.
But what about when the differences are a product of a very different worldview? Mm-hmm. Not just different interpretations of how to apply commonly held beliefs, but actually different beliefs as your very starting point. And I imagine some of this might have be a bit of your experience being a Christian within a secular environment, and how do you navigate that when the vision of the moral life may in fact be different?
Right. Well, there may be some layers to answering that question. One is there are going to be points in a diverse democracy where we just have zero-sum incommensurable differences. We're not going to be able to find some happy middle ground or compromise, and there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. And often the stakes are going to feel enormous. And the answer then is not to turn to despair or to violence, but it's to go back to the democratic system and try to persuade the rest of the people around you that your case is actually the better one. And sometimes that takes, days, and sometimes it takes decades. But that's the role of the citizen in a democracy. And then when you find yourself on the losing end of that within, say, a political system or even an institution, I think for Christians, that's really an opportunity, because you can start now with the premise that you're not in control, and that's okay, because our faith isn't about having control of the world around us. It's actually recognizing that we're never in control, but we trust the author of a much bigger, much longer story whose ending we're assured of, and then we participate faithfully in our small role there. And that's actually quite freeing, because it means you don't have to win. You just have to be faithful and engage with what you're called to do.
So you've used this language of, being on the winning side, being on the losing side, but ultimately, even if you are on quote unquote the losing side, you're on the winning side in some ways, if I'm hearing you correctly, because you know how the story ends as a follower of Jesus. You have this assurance that while we're not in control, God is in control. How do you expand that view, though, when, again, there isn't a shared premise that God exists in a pluralistic society, that we don't have to be in control. Maybe you could say this to Christians, or perhaps
Right.
even to other people with religious convictions. But what do you do when you're in a secularized or pluralistic society in which that isn't a shared perspective?
Yeah, well, one thing you can't do is assume a common baseline of understanding. So the work of translation becomes much harder. You have to do a lot more foundation laying with people, and you can't just go out there and pronounce your views about hope or something that they might not share. So meet them where they are and figure out what motivates them, I think, is step one. But there also comes a point where you're just going to be thinking and engaging from very different perspectives. If you are someone in the world who thinks this world is all there is, there's nothing that comes after this, then why wouldn't you devote everything you have to winning in this world, or to having your side or your policy preferences won? And there are people, unfortunately, there are also people inside the church who operate with that mentality, and those outside the church as well. And so I think the posture has to be to model a different kind of engagement that just reflects hope and maybe shows it rather than says it all of the time, and with the goal of persuading and convincing those around us that this is actually not just the right way to live eternally, but also a much healthier way to engage with the world around us today.
All right, you're a professor. Grade us right now as a culture. How are we doing on this vision? And if we're doing well, great, we could take a pass. But if we're not doing well, why aren't we doing well?
Yeah, we're not doing well. Even in the world of today's great inflation, I would have to rate us pretty low right now. I think one reason, there's just something peculiarly American about this, isn't there? The sense that so many American Christians seem to think that the kingdom of God hinges upon what happens in this country, which is a theologically absurd position, right? So one thing to do is just to look more historically and more globally at what God does and has done and is doing through his people, and to recognize that we do have a responsibility where we are in our current context. This is Leslie Newbegin, right? We have to work out our faith in the context in which we find ourselves, and yet we can't be overly determined by our small context when we serve a much bigger God and are part of a much more global and historical church. And so I think the key to overcoming the current malaise or the mediocrity on the grading scale, I think, is to have much bigger imaginations.
This is for the Christian world. You have a foot in two worlds, though. Deeply aware of what's going on in Christian evangelical world, but also in the broader society, secular society. Like, how are we doing in that regard with these complexities?
Yeah, this is kind of, I think, a good news, bad news story. So the good news is we have, as a society, moved into a much more, I would say, authentically pluralistic reality, where we see and recognize the very different voices around us. There was a kind of, you might call it a Protestant middle-class consensus that dominated American society for a long time. One reason that it dominated is that it just shut out a lot of other voices. And so the fact that we have more dissonance, more dissent, more diversity in the current mix, I think, is a good thing. The downside is that it makes it much harder to connect on common ground themes. So when we ask, what is the purpose of this country, or what does it mean to pursue human flourishing, when we can't actually agree on those very big but very basic questions, it makes it very difficult to figure out who we the people are. And I think we're in this country today feeling that current strain, and there aren't very easy answers to get out of that without some sort of overarching framework that unites us. So I think, as a broader society, as a broader culture, maybe I'd put us on probation right now.
Yeah, John, this brings me back to the comments earlier on. That, what do we do when we have the application of a commonly shared set of values or a constitution we're all working off of in the legal space? That's one set of things where you negotiate the differences. But when you don't have a constitution to guide us, or when you don't have a common moral narrative, national narrative, then it's both having to deal with how do you apply principles, but actually, how do you produce the moral vision to guide the principles itself? So, what's the distinct place of Christianity in this? Because surely we have not invented this problem. The church has been in these situations before. The birth of the church in a time where there are deeply different views in the Greco-Roman world than the Christian worldview. So give us some perspective on that, whether historical or from your life experience, or even from the law classroom.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take, to give you a practical example. I teach at Washington University in St. Louis, which is, I love this university. My colleagues, my students, they're brilliant. It's not at all a Christian place, and it's never going to be a Christian place. So my starting position is I do not control this place, and I never will. And what that means is then I have to figure out how to operate within it as a Christian in a way that many people will find my core commitments unfamiliar or strange or weird. And, the fact that as a Christian I would pursue certain practices or priorities or beliefs would be strange to them. So I have to work harder at maybe being understood. When you find yourself in any majority position, whether it's a majority culture position or political or otherwise, you can sometimes forget about the hard work of translation because other people will have to adjust to your baseline understandings. When you're not in control, you can't afford that luxury. You always have to be working to make sure that you're understood or engaged by the people who are in control. And I think that's generalizable for Christians in broader society today. You mentioned the early church. They were great at this, right? A lot of it was through their lived witness and their practices as much as what they were saying, but they had to be distinctive, sometimes in a way that was very destabilizing to the people around them, but other times in ways that was very attractive and, even in the strangeness attractive to the people around them. But I think for the early church, never forgetting, because they couldn't, that they were this distinct political and cultural minority was a really useful and creative practice for them. I think it's a lot harder in the contemporary United States because Christianity has such a historical stronghold and footprint on so much of our culture and our laws and our social fabric that it would be weird to say Christians are a minority in a political sense. But there is a sense in which we're no longer able to assume a baseline where everyone around us understands the basics of the gospel or something like that. And that can be very destabilizing or anxiety producing, but it could also be imagination generative in a different way, right? We could say, wow, what an opportunity when people don't understand at all what we're talking about. What an opportunity to reestablish why what we believe matters and is different.
Yeah, that seems like a unique tension. In my work connecting with global Christians, there are many contexts in which they're clearly in the minority position, maybe even a very persecuted, marginalized position. And there's no question that they have to take this kind of mindset of translation, because that's just their lived reality. And there are segments within America in certain areas of the country where it's clearly post-Christian. And to be a Christian there means you are beginning that work of translation just as the default position. But as a nation, we're in this kind of ambiguous in-between spot where in some ways there are, as you're describing, values that we can assume and share. And yet the articulation of those values may not even be understood to be Christian. They may be perceived to be just some generic civic religion. Help us think through, navigate that when there isn't an evenness that we can just say, oh, we're on the margins, we need to posture ourselves accordingly, or we're in the majority and we can assume that. We're just in this kind of funky in-between place. Like, help us think through that.
Yeah, I wonder, as you were talking, it made me think what we really need are very careful, I guess the cultural equivalent of archaeologists or anthropologists or historians who can look at our current and past environment in this country and say, how did we get here? And then to, without being defensive or offensive about it, just to show how embedded and important Christian ideas are to Western jurisprudence and law, for example, that we have notions of something like human rights only out of a very Christian tradition. And it's important to engage with those concepts, notions of dignity, for example, without getting parochial or defensive about them, but just pointing out to our neighbors, you care about dignity and human rights, so do I. And let me work with you to show you where that comes from and why it matters to our culture today. That's a very different argument than saying this is a Christian nation, right? Or Christianity control the norms. It's more nuanced than that. And it's saying more of, let me help you unpack the background that you might not even know of that informs your core intuitions and beliefs today. And it's, I think, more invitational and more conversational.
So that's an interesting positive, exploration of the things that need to be unearthed and kind of the origins of our views of human rights or dignity or mutual responsibilities, justice, et cetera, et cetera. I want to do a similar kind of archaeological work, I'm picking your metaphor, on some of our present dysfunctions. Mm-hmm. So if there are positive things to discover of the origins of our justice system or sense of rights, is there a similar thing that if we do archaeology on our present dysfunctions, we'll discover that there are some things kind of rooted in the American way of doing life, community, that leads to or made us more open to, vulnerable to the current contentions that we're facing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we probably should just go back to the Reformation and start there, right? I mean, so, but part of the challenge is when you recognize as a political or cultural matter that there should be dissent against the reigning orthodoxies, or that you can't just accept authority on its face, that opens up a lot of possibility, but it also opens up a lot of risk. And the question of, I mentioned the Reformation because the question of, once you challenge the authority of the church and say, no, this isn't right, we can't just recognize this purely by faith or assent, then where does that stop? And this is really the great ecclesial problem of Protestantism, since the Reformation. We are experiencing that today. There's a way in which that also infuses American culture and the kind of post-Enlightenment individualism and autonomy that we see in American culture today. And, there are lots of upsides to that, but it does come at the challenge of community and authority and solidarity and common ground. And so we can look back at the historical and intellectual roots of all of this and realize this has been a long time coming, and you can't really just unring it with a quick fix. It's going to take a lot of generations to build back a sense of why it might matter to have an antidote or a counterpoint to individual conscience and dissent and autonomy and all of these things that, as Protestants and as Americans, we deeply value. And yet there is a dark side to that as well.
I've also run across words in your writing and speaking, forgiveness. What do we mean by those terms? I mean, how are you using those terms?
Well, one of the things, this goes back to something you asked earlier, but the ways in which Christians in particular are called to translate and engage with broader culture, I think part of doing that well is also recognizing the limits to translation. Empathy, I think, is a deeply Christian-rooted term, but it's also very approachable from other contexts. And we can talk about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and trying to understand the other person. And we can do that theologically, but we can also come at that from other different worldviews and perspectives. Forgiveness, I think, is a lot harder. I mean, forgiveness in some ways seems to me a very theological term. We certainly have examples of non-theological forgiveness. Nelson Mandela famously not, enacting a kind of forgiveness that was not rooted in religious faith. But for the most part, for forgiveness to be coherent, I think it often has to be rooted in a larger faith narrative. So I think when I invoke something like forgiveness or hope, I'm often doing so from a very distinctly theologically Christian perspective and wanting people to be curious about it, but maybe not expecting them fully to understand. And then on the other hand, when I talk about something like empathy or humility or patience, these are, I think, more generalizable ideas that can be understood and embraced from lots of different perspectives.
Yeah, the willingness to forgive is just very, very difficult. But the theological understanding of why we would forgive in the first place, I mean, that does seem like a foreign concept in so many ways, interpersonally even. But then you scale it up nationally or communities, it becomes extraordinarily difficult. I mean, your own heritage as someone with a Japanese forebear, I mean, that's a profoundly complicated question of what happened to the Japanese American within American history. And talk a little bit about that, like how even from your own personal familial background, the notion of forgiveness, the notion of national responsibilities, community, and its impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to the difference between forgiving maybe an individual in a personal relationship where you can actually envision not just the wrong that's been done, but the wrongdoer in a very human way, versus how do you forgive a system or a government or something like that. So as I explore and learning to disagree, visiting the site of Manzanar internment camp where my grandparents were taken and my father was born, and actually standing on the spot where they were incarcerated for a number of years, and just kind of reflecting on all of the costs of that to them and to my dad as a really for his entire life shaped by that experience of birth, and then trying to sort through what it means to enact forgiveness in that context. For my grandmother, who really had her life destroyed by the government, to be able to say, and yet I forgive, and I love this country, and I see both its imperfections but also its possibilities. And to do that not just against a particular human wrongdoer, but against a system that had conspired and deeply taken from her in a way that was never going to be restored fully or reconciled in this lifetime. And I think that's part of the key to the theological nature of forgiveness, that has to be looking towards something much greater and much bigger than just what happens in this world. We're so often, and I encounter this a lot in law, we see an injustice in the world and we want justice, but really human justice is at best going to be a proxy to the wrong, to remedying the wrong that's happened. We're not going to see shalom or peace fully restored in this world with human justice. And the possibility of forgiveness opens up this new horizon that says, in spite of this pain, in spite of this injustice, there is a hopeful, imaginative future ahead of us. And in many cases, that's individual, but it's also deeply political and social. When Desmond Tutu writes the book, No Future Without Forgiveness, I think he's making a political point, and to move forward as a society where we inevitably will keep hurting and harming each other. If we can choose and figure out a path of forgiveness, then there is a much more credible future than the alternative.
What does that look like in our present moment? I mean, maybe we have to step into this gingerly, but are there topics, are there issues right now that we need to learn how to exercise forgiveness, even taking the initiative as Christians, when it won't be reciprocated?
I think this starts with recognizing that we are in need of forgiveness and that we are capable of being forgiven. And I think Christians have both of those assurances from Scripture. And if we can embody that and model that to other people, then that might present a way forward. It starts by recognizing that we are flawed and sinful people, and we are contributing to the pains of this world. One of the things that I reflected on in learning to disagree was some of the sanctimony in all directions around various COVID policies, and how people were so sure that what they were doing was right and what other people were doing was wrong. And nobody got it right in those early months of COVID. We were all trying our best and screwing up, and then to be able to look back on that and to ask for forgiveness, knowing that you need to be forgiven, but then also being someone who can be forgiven, that nothing that you did was beyond the possibility of forgiveness, and to hold that loosely. And I think that comes with a kind of humility and gratitude and finitude to everything that we do. And when we replace that with a posture of certainty or a clinging to power, it becomes much harder to envision forgiveness or grace.
Forgiveness and grace seem to be difficult concepts to square with concept of fairness. Like there's so much in our society about this needs to be fixed because it's not fair, where forgiveness assumes something truly not fair has been done, and yet I will, with grace, respond. Like, how do we put those things together? I mean, is forgiveness license to give up on fairness? I would hope not, but how does this all work together?
Well, you can certainly, forgiveness and punishment can certainly coexist. So in an imperfect human society, we're going to need law-backed punishment, and we're going to need to have some social wrongs addressed through different forms of punishment, whether it's incarceration or other means. And at the same time, forgiveness can exist alongside of that. So forgiveness is not always an alternative to punishment or accountability. You can think of, for example, in some of the sexual abuse situations in churches, the possibility of forgiveness, and yet at the same time you would very much want accountability. You would want people out of positions of power. You would want to see them face punitive measures for their abuses of authority, and those can exist at the same time. But I think there's a related point, which is that when it comes to something like fairness, if we're just keeping a ledger of fairness in our own lives, we're never gonna win that accounting, because we will inevitably feel like life stacks various challenges and degrees of unfairness upon us, or conversely, we have this unearned, unmerited benefit, and it's rarely going to squarely hit zero or perfection. And so the alternative to say, we are both not deserving of grace, but we receive grace, is really a wonderful and freeing place to be. And then I think for Christians to put that in the perspective of a broader communal and collective promise from God, that redemption and the promise of what is to come is not really mired in a kind of individual accounting, but it's to God's people and it's to his church holistically. I was thinking about this as I was working on Uncommon Ground with Tim Keller, and we were spending a lot of time in Jeremiah, and it occurred to me that the promise of God to the Jews in the Jews in Babylon was not, you individual person will be rescued from this place, because some of those individual people would suffer massive injustices and they would be harmed and they would die. Mm-hmm. But the people collectively had a promise of deliverance. And I think if we could envision more of that in our own churches and our own spaces, we would, I think, have a better sense of what God is doing with his church, not just, a promise of fairness to you or to me.
Mm. I want to pull out a little bit on the observation you made that, punitive justice, getting people out of power, for instance, doesn't have to stand against forgiveness. There can be these simultaneous applications of fairness and forgiveness. But there's a sense in which getting people out, recognizing that certain harms need to be stopped. I wonder, at what point do you look at difficult conversations and just say, there's a line and there's an injustice that's happening here, or a difference that's, it's really intractable. So the conversation, we just need to agree to disagree, or we need to walk away from that. Like, does that mean a failure has happened? Like, how do we nuance the gradation of the kinds of
Yeah.
conversations.
I don't think it necessarily means failure. I mean, I think as Christians, we start with the premise that everyone we encounter is an image bearer. So we can't surrender that possibility. I don't think we have the option to say, well, you're not really forgivable, right? Or you're not really a human being or whatever. I mean, we don't have that option. Everyone is an image bearer, full stop. But we are not personally called to persevere and engage in every single relationship or every single broken institution. I mean, I think for a lot of Christians, there's probably too much of a hero complex that we have to be part of every possible battle or mission or rescue story, and that's its own form of pride as well. That really, we need to discern more of not only when to speak, but when not to speak, which relationships to pursue, which relationships to let go. And sometimes, if you're in one of those situations where you're just in an impasse, it's not a healthy relationship, maybe you're experiencing trauma of some kind, the wisest, healthiest thing is to get out of that relationship, not feel like you have to pursue it at all costs.
There's an element of faith that you're not a part of every solution. You are not the Christ. Christ is the Christ, and God is at work. I think of the scriptures of these stories where you get these snippets like a Melchizedek in Genesis that, wait a second, who is this figure? God's clearly at work, and he swoops into the narrative of the Bible, and he swoops out, and we don't get the full story of what God is doing. Or in Amos, this little verse that talks about God being with the Israelites, but he was also with the Cushites, and he brought the Philistines from Capthor and the Arameans from Kir. So wait a second, there were other kinds of deliverances that God was doing in different people groups, and this recognition that God is that big, and he really is working by his grace in the life that is commonly held with all humans. That takes a lot of faith when the psyche of most Americans is the can-do attitude. Like, we just are going to go in and we're going to fix things. And so that's a deeply difficult place to have the responsibility to be engaged, but actually the faith to disengage and trust that, God's still at work. That's a tough spot. And I imagine in your own work, as you're teaching folks to do this, you're having to grapple with the fact that a winsome witness will not always accomplish what you desired, and that there's a faith that needs to be exercised. Do you ever want to just give up? Like, gosh, this approach, because Tim Keller has been criticized over the years, and then certainly even after his death, as saying, that winsome witness thing might have worked in New York during those decades, but gosh, that winsome witness is not effective. It's not what our moment calls for. Do you still believe that type of approach is worth pursuing, even when it doesn't seem like it always produces the results that we hope?
Well, I mean, the framing of producing results, I think, is one to look into a little more deeply, because, and this connects to your point about, relying on Jesus and not on ourselves, that maybe the results that we're part of producing are going to unfold generations from now, long after you and I are, buried and dead. And that's also okay, that we're not promised seeing the fruits of our labor, and maybe the bricks and the building blocks that we're part of now are just something, we're just kind of doing the very initial building for something that comes way after we're gone. And that's okay as well. And that's also, I think, reason to hope. I think the beauty of being rooted in the narrative of Scripture is that we can just so quickly see how long and how big this story is. You look at these passages about generations after generations, and you realize that how small we really are, and that's okay. Now, in the moment, you can still, I think, feel discouraged by it all, but I rarely feel alone, not just for reasons of faith and prayer, but also because I look around at the people who are kind of with me, and I realize there are a lot of people who, you don't need to control the world. You just need a few people with you. And I think we have those people all around us, and they're encouraging us on. Some of them are, with us today. Some of them have already moved on. Some of them are, with us through their words from books they wrote centuries ago. But there is a long and large collective witness of people who are reminding us that it's going to be okay. You're a bit player in all of this. You need to be faithful. You need to love God and love neighbor, but you might not know how the story ends in your lifetime, and that's okay.
Oh, John, I'm trying to buck the need to have a 5-year strategic plan to fix all of this, but to be called into this longer, faithful obedience. What is some word of counsel that you would give to us in this moment, even though we know that we're not going to see the end of the story in our lifetime, but using the few building blocks that are ours to use? What would those building blocks be to repair the relationship between Christians and the broader culture?
Yeah, I would say this. We've been talking a lot about the long term, right? The long term as in the story of Scripture and the redemption of the created order. And that has to be, I think, the root of our Christian hope. We also, I think, are fixated on the short term far too often. What happens in the next election, or what happens in the next Supreme Court nomination, or whatever it is. And I think the building block I would encourage is, let's focus on the midterm. Focus not on the next election cycle, but 10 years from now, what are the institutions that you and I are investing in and building and cultivating that 10 years from now will be around with open arms to the people who are hurting around them? Because we don't know exactly who those people will be or why they'll be hurting, but we do know there will be a lot of hurting people around us. And if we build institutions that are either too insular or too afraid or too short-lived, that they won't effectively be there in 10 years, then we're not going to be open to where we might be called to engage and invest relationally. But if we build these institutions and say, we're ready for you to come, or to come back in many cases, in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, and we recognize and remind each other that we're all works in progress, then I think that's a pretty exciting vision. And it makes the hard work of the building not necessarily solely for the purpose of some multi-generational story, but with a little bit of a longer horizon than next year's ROI or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard a fellow leader describe his vision of leadership in these midterm ways of saying, we often overestimate what we could accomplish in 1 year, but underestimate what we could accomplish in a decade. And that as we persist and move things forward, that real change can happen. So 1 decade from now, Lord willing, building blocks being used, what are some concrete things you would hope for us to be able to actually see?
Well, I would love to see, and I don't want to name specific ministries, but I can think of, different national campus ministries, different local churches, different movements right now that can be strengthened and cultivated so that they are present and credible in the institutions around them, whether that's higher education or the realm of politics or journalism or media or entertainment. But for Christians to continue to be engaged in those sectors and professions, but in a way that it really is working toward this midterm building, and in a way that remains, I don't want to say non-judgmental, because you do have to judge, you have to use discernment, and you have to, you can't just lapse into relativism, but a kind of, I guess, compassion or grace, so that the person who might be fighting against you for the next 10 years, you're still willing to say, come on over when you're ready. And you might have gone down a very dark path, whether it's politics or self-interest or something else, and to be able to say, we're still ready to have you back. That would be, I think, a wonderful way for Christians to witness to those around them. And then I think I would also love to see very concretely more attention to questions of formation. And this raises, a whole host of issues that we don't have time to talk about, but whether it's social media or AI or biotechnology, whatever else is coming, like a freight train, if Christians are formed to be people who know they're rooted in this different story, know the kinds of practices that they're called to show, then I think these challenges, they might be very unfamiliar and very unnerving, but it'll be okay. But if we haven't rooted ourselves in the formation and formational practices with people around us, then I think we're very susceptible to being swept away by some of these challenges.
John, thanks for your wisdom. Thanks for being very present in this conversation and offering what you have offered to us.
It's been great to be with you. Thanks, Walter, for the conversation.